I would note we've already acknowledged that 19.6% overall percent of GDP revenue to the Treasury, which would put it at historic highs. I assume the director would agree that that's a relatively high historic percentage of revenue to the Treasury.
Yeah, we would be in line with where we were in the mid-90s.
But nevertheless, those are very high levels as a relative basis of percentage of GDP, but we're also acknowledging that we're increasing spending next year to $6.8 trillion, $500 billion more than FY23. $82 trillion over 10 years. $82 trillion of spending over 10 years. But we're trying to praise
in research in this country.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back, and now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Director Young, for joining us here today. I would note we've already acknowledged that 19.6% overall percent of GDP revenue to the Treasury, which would put it at historic highs. I assume the director would agree that that's a relatively high historic percentage of revenue to the Treasury.
Yeah, we would be in line with where we were in the mid-90s.
But nevertheless, those are very high levels as a relative basis of percentage of GDP, but we're also acknowledging that we're increasing spending next year to $6.8 trillion, $500 billion more than FY23. $82 trillion over 10 years. $82 trillion of spending over 10 years. But we're trying to praise a $3 trillion so-called reduction in the deficit, despite the fact we're spending $82 trillion. Here's where I want to kind of go. What are the priorities of this administration when I look at what I see in the budget? Here's some of the spending items that are brought to my attention. $3.9 billion for the Department of Homeland Security Climate Resilience Program. $3.9 billion because the administration cares about a climate crisis more than the crisis at our border. $109 million going to Mexico. Mexico for law enforcement and military support. This despite the fact that our border is overrun and Mexico has lost complete control along our southern border. $3.5 billion for the FBI's new headquarters. $3.5 billion for the FBI to have a brand new headquarters in Maryland. $1.8 billion more for the Internal Revenue Service on top of the $80 billion that was given to the IRS last year. $1.6 billion for the United Nations Green Climate Fund, which includes $100 million to go to China for greening its economy. $108 million for the World Health Organization, which conspired and colluded with the CCP to cover up COVID and parroted the CCP propaganda. I've been combing over the budget to find any reductions in outlays or cuts in this administration's budget. There are precious few. Where I could find a couple of actual reductions was, for example, in reductions to Border Patrol, reductions to ICE, actual cuts to the spending for those particular programs, but that is supposedly offset by $4.7 billion for a new Southwest Border Contingency Fund to respond to migrant surges. But here's the thing. Those are restricted, according to the language that I see. Eligible uses for the funds include soft-sided facilities, transportation detention beds, alternative detention, and shelter and services programs to organizations caring for non-citizen adults. In other words, that is additional money for more processing with cuts and reductions to the actual enforcement of the law. Those are the priorities of this administration. So one thing that I would like to have at the end of this is I would like for the OMB to produce for us a list of specific reductions in outlays throughout the president's budget. Because I'm combing over them and I'm finding precious little reduction in outlays, but the only outlay I could find that was serious reductions were to DHS's Border Patrol and ICE. I would also note that there was $114.7 million for diversity and inclusion activities at the Department of Defense. $114 million for diversity and inclusion activities. The Air Force Academy curriculum that recommended cadets avoided gendered language like mom and dad. A United States Marine Corps report that was studying whether we should use sir and ma'am for our drill instructors. A memo from the Department of Defense Secretary Austin recognizing transgender and gender nonconforming persons. The Naval Academy Admiral that told midshipmen to read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. $91,000 for diversity and inclusion seminars for the Air Force Band. $180,000 salary for a senior diversity official at the Air Force, which is more than a member of Congress gets paid. And how about Kalissa Wing, who serves as the Department of Defense Education Activities Diversity Chief? 2020 tweet, I'm so exhausted at these white folks in these PD, professional development sessions. This lady actually had the audacity to say black people can be racist too. I had to stop the session and give Karen the business. We are not the majority. We don't have the power. Are these the priorities of the current administration, to fund the kinds of offices that hire individuals that use this kind of divisive racist language? Is that the priorities of this president's budget? And you have criticized our plan, some conservatives in Congress plan to shrink Washington and grow America. The House Freedom Caucus plan wouldn't reduce the deficit by 1 penny. Which is it? All I've heard today from my Democratic colleagues is all the horrifying cuts that are going to occur. Which is it? Because you're going to say that we're not going to reduce the deficit when you say that we're going to stop a student loan bailout of $400 billion. You're telling me that wouldn't reduce the FY 2023 deficit, to eliminate a $400 billion bailout of student loans, that it wouldn't reduce the deficit if we were to reclaim $91 billion of unspent COVID money, or $80 billion from the IRS expansion, or $78 billion from the so-called Inflation Reduction Act's unspent climate funds, or $270 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act's so-called energy subsidies, or getting Americans back to work under SNAP or Medicaid. All of this that we proposed in the House Freedom Caucus budget would save $4.82 trillion over 10 years.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
And Mr. Chair, since there was obviously a lot there for the last 3 or 4 minutes, I would ask the indulgence if the OMB director could actually respond to some of that if she wishes. I would ask that. I think that would be appropriate.
Yes, we'll give just a few seconds to do what you can on that, Director Young.
Just a few seconds. There are spending cuts you have outlined that we've talked a lot about here today. However, if you continue the tax cuts, which has also been a stated policy goal, of those making over $400,000 and skewed to the wealthy, you use all of those savings for extending those tax cuts. That is where the analysis came from.
And where in the Freedom Caucus proposal that was put out publicly was there any mention of the tax cuts? Putting aside the debate over tax cuts, which is a meritorious debate, but there was no mention of that. So how can then the gentlelady say, oh, this is...
Time has expired on this.
The time was extended, the question was laid out, and the allegation was made that it was about taxes, which is not
Certainly, sir, appreciate the vigor of the conversation with that. Next, we will call on